Okay, go ahead, Karen, you can start.
All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Karen Leo Hill, and I am the incoming chair of the Upper Valley Democrats. Really appreciate everyone being here tonight, especially this week, right as we're in the thick of the holidays. 32 people. We did a session on lobbying a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about the upcoming legislative session that's going to be starting just after the new year. And we were talking about how the legislative process works, but we didn't really have a chance to get into some of the substance. But there are some major topics that are happening right here in New Hampshire. We're on the front lines of some very bad legislation. And so, as kind of as a follow up to the session we did on lobbying, we decided that we would focus tonight on education. And in just a minute, Deb is going to introduce our speakers. And we're really lucky to have some just really seasoned experts in this area to talk about the state of legislative affairs around education. And in particular, we're going to be talking about the loyalty oath. We're going to be talking about critical race theory, the divisive concepts bill from last year, late breaking legal developments that Brian's going to be talking about as well, and then also the impact that education has on our property taxes here at the local level in New Hampshire. And the whole point is to try and get us ready so that we can participate in the legislative session that's coming up, that we can talk to not just our legislators, but also other legislators, and we can be a part ultimately of grassroots activism to make a difference and try and stop some of the bad legislation and help advance some of the good legislation. And that's our whole point as being Upper Valley Democrats. We know that when we work together, we can make a difference. And so tonight we're going to do a deep dive, or at least as deep as we can get in about an hour or so of time, on the topic of education. Thank you for being here. I'm going to turn it over to Deb. And just a reminder, if you are not speaking, it's great if you can keep yourself on mute so that we don't have background noise interfering. And then there will be time for Q&A, and Deb will be moderating that when it comes down to it. Over to you, Deb.
Thank you so much, Karen. So I'm going to get right to it. Our speakers tonight are trading off childcare duty, and that's because they are married. Brian Hawkins is currently the Director of Government Relations for NEA New Hampshire, the state's largest educators union, one I am proud to say I belong to, where he oversees the legislative, political, and member communications around key education policy issues. Prior to NEA, Brian served in a similar role at the State Employees Association, SEIU, Local 1984. I find that number resonates, advocating for public employees and good wages and benefits for all members, all workers. When he's not making sausage at the state legislature, he can be found whipping up spaghetti and meatballs in the kitchen, where he's also currently perfecting the world's best hummus with the help of his 6-year-old daughter and 2-year-old son. And I would like to introduce and then turn over things to Brian.
Thank you very much, Deb. Hi, everybody. It is getting messy in the kitchen when we start to make those recipes, but it's fun. And I see a lot of friends on here, so and I want to thank especially I see some of Senator Prentice and some other state representatives who have just been tremendous allies at the legislature, and so thank you for everything that you're doing. Educators really count on it, need it, and are thankful for it. And I'll say, for myself, it's an honor to work for educators, especially being a dad for my daughter's just entered the school system in the last couple of years, and over the last couple of years during this pandemic, that they've just been a tremendous asset to children to the state, and it really is an honor to work for them. So there, as Deb said, there is a lot going on. I thought I would deviate slightly from what I originally intended on starting with, because of this morning, NEA New Hampshire and several other allies of ours, strong allies, New Hampshire ACLU, GLAD, the Disability Rights Center, and two DEI coordinators in our public school systems filed a federal lawsuit against the banned concepts law that was passed in the New Hampshire legislature using the budget process to jam it into law. And this is probably one of the issues, one of the most hot button issues of the legislative session, and certainly one that has one of the broadest reaching impacts, particularly because it has such a tremendous impact on all of our students, on 160,000 students that are going through our public school system. And so so we were proud to stand with those other organizations today and file that suit. You'll probably see some coverage later on if you haven't on TV about it, but the central part of that was that we are challenging the constitutionality of the law. And I am not the attorney for NEA New Hampshire, so I'm gonna do my best. But I think it was since it happened this morning, I wanted to make sure we address it. And so we are challenging the vagueness of this law, the chilling effect that it has because of that, the chilling effect that it has on education that happens in the classroom, because what we know has happened is that it has prevented certain materials from being used in classrooms. It's prevented plenty of discussions from happening in classrooms, including educators who, fear because of the consequences of this law, that an educator can lose their livelihood, that they can lose their certification to teach. When we've sought further guidance as to what this law actually says, but what we know is they don't want to be too specific because they want it to be a trap. They want it to be a trap for teachers in the classroom, and so we've challenged that, and where we have a really talented group of attorneys, some really brave clients that are a part of this, and we're eager to get into to court and make our case. So maybe I'll pause there for a second, or do we want to do questions at the end, Deb?
Yes, why don't we do questions at the end and
Okay.
Give people a chance to absorb and think a little bit about the range of issues that are facing educators right now.
Sure. So one of the things that we've been telling our members for the upcoming session is it's hard to talk about it in specific bills because the list would be so long. Just House bills alone that are going to the House Education Committee, for example, we're expecting around 100 bills just in going to that committee, and we haven't even gotten to the Senate or some of the other bills that go to other committees but still impact students, still impact teachers, and so we've been really talking about them in buckets. And as a transition from the lawsuit, I'll start with one bucket, which is this issue around critical race theory, curriculum, and really what we've seen is clearly the attempt to double down on what they passed in the budget. And there's no better example of that than House Bill 1255, which many of you have probably heard about. It's been dubbed the Teacher Loyalty Bill, and it takes a 1940s communism scare era law that I don't think a lot of people even knew existed on the books anymore, and turns it into this banned concepts law we have, and sort of puts it on steroids, because it essentially says that educators cannot portray any sort of negative, can't have really a negative portrayal about any of the founding of the country. And like the current law that we have, it is it's vague, but it is certainly takes the current law a step further, and they add the same exact consequences for an educator, which is if they violate this, it is considered a violation of the Educator Code of Conduct, which can result in losing one's certification to educator certification. And so the stakes are high, just as with the current law. And the bill is even more egregious. That's not to distract from the fact that our current law is extremely bad, and why we are suing the Commissioner Edelblut and the Attorney General over this. But it is something that we have to take seriously, something where, we might have thought, a year ago that they would never pass all this stuff. They would never pass divisive concepts or anything like that. But we know that it's a very different group that is in the majority as compared to years past, and so we have to account for that. Then there's all sorts of other ways they get at curriculum, but that's the one I wanted to highlight in that bucket. The second bucket I wanted to highlight was the issue of the privatization of public education, and really sort of the same thing in that they are looking to double down on some of what was passed in the budget process last year. As you know, we got our first school voucher program that has already far exceeded budget projections, and not because there's an exodus of students from public schools, but what we know is this is really spending on people who had already made the choice to exercise their right to send their kid to private or homeschool. But so most of the spending on this is brand new. But what House Republicans in particular want to do, and they did this through the retain bill process at the very end of right before the deadline, is to jam through committee a local voucher program that would utilize not state dollars but your local tax dollars, and put a portion of those toward school vouchers. And depending on your community, that looks very different. But there are a series of egregious, like the state bill, there are a series of egregious components to this, including that there's no income limit to this, to qualify for this. So we would be paying for millionaires. Your property tax dollars would be going to pay for millionaires to send their kids to private school. And even if your community decided this was a bad idea, it's not been good for our community schools, our community public schools, you're stuck, because you have to continue paying for those parents who are millionaires, you have to continue paying that until the child graduates from high school. So, and that's just a couple components. Before I conclude later on, NEA New Hampshire did a fact sheet on this bill, which I'll drop in the chat, and feel free to use it. Another organization that we look to frequently for presentations and research, Reaching Higher, they just did a webinar on this bill earlier this afternoon. And so I would encourage you to look that up as well. I know it was reported, and they usually do terrific work in analyzing bills and see how that this legislation would affect your community. The third and final, not the final bucket, but the third major bucket on education has also to do with really public health, because it is a series of bills submitted to the legislature that wants to stop the ability of schools to keep kids and the staff in school safe by preventing, and we've seen this in other states, right? We've seen this in Florida with some really extreme governors where they want to prevent schools from taking the mitigation efforts that they need. Now, we would have preferred, of course, that the state would actually take a little bit more of a proactive approach to mitigation in schools. But instead, the governor sort of just left every school district on their own to do what they're going to do. A lot of this legislation would go further than that. It's to prevent schools from instituting things like universal masking, vaccine requirements for staff or for students. And I think there are dozens of bills on that. There are probably at least 100 bills just on something to do with COVID, a couple of hundred bills maybe, but there's a good chunk of those that have to do with specifically related to the pandemic in schools. And so as we're going into the legislative session, those are the sort of three buckets of priority and concern that we have. We're also thankful that we're looking to a lot of our friends in the legislature who file bills on the opposite end of those three buckets, bills that would help keep students, and staff safe in schools, bills that would actually protect the ability of teachers to talk about these needed conversations and an accurate and honest history in school, and bills that would repeal or significantly curb the state voucher program and the commissioner's effort to privatize public education. So that's my story. I'll pause there, and I'm definitely happy to take any questions.
Great. And I just asked people to either put a question into the chat, or down at the bottom, there's a little thing that says reactions, and you can raise your hand, and I will look to see if anybody has their hand up with a question as I scroll through participants, and I will call on you while I wait and look. I would like to ask Brian one quick follow-up. You said one of the bills talks about not requiring vaccine. Is this specific to COVID, or is this going to overturn the whole history of childhood inoculations that are currently required by school for children to attend, like measles, mumps, rubella, polio, etc.?
From what I could tell at the time that I saw I don't think the language had come out the last time I looked at it, but it looked like it was specific to COVID.
Okay.
Yeah.
So at least we're not going completely backwards, just a little backwards.
I'm not promising that one isn't in a bill whose language hasn't come out yet, but not that I've seen as of yet. I'm happy to be corrected by any of the legislators who are on today, but.
Would you also, again, I'm waiting to see if anybody has a question. Would you also speak to, you said that if somebody is receiving a voucher, it will be until that child graduates from high school. Am I correct that there is no end date? Once you get a voucher, you have it until the end of 12th grade?
For House Bill 607, the bill that, and actually I neglected to mention, that is coming up for a vote probably the first day that the House meets on January 5th. So education usually is early on in the calendar because they go alphabetically. So right after they do the vetoes and commerce, they'll get to education. And so it should be on that first day. And this proposal would say that once you are you're in until you graduate. And so that community would continue to pay based off of the calculation that they lay out in the bill for basically a voucher for that student until they graduate high school, or as old as 20 actually. And they could not, well, one, it says that voucher amount can never be lower than the first year that you get it, which is also, what I can't imagine that they would ever pass something like that for any other public program that they were looking to institute. But even if the community says, you know what, this has not been good for our community, we are going to vote this out, they cannot cease those payments again until graduation. So that's a little different than the current state program.
Mm-hmm.
The current state program, if you enroll in a public school, you still get to keep the money that you've received through to the point where you graduate, but you don't continue to receive payments.
Okay, so I noticed that Karen Chase and then Karen Leah Hill have a question. So Karen Chase, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hello, Brian. Karen Chase. I've been following the Executive Council's recent decision on funding Prenda, the homeschool program. And I'm really interested in that specifically because it's funded at a much higher amount of money going to homeschooling than I think has previously ever been permitted. And that would also fold into what you're talking about. It is part of my question. And also, second is that was just, there were no competing companies. This was just approved by Governor Sununu, by Sununu, and then approved by Executive Council. That's my understanding. Is that correct?
That's correct. So the Prenda contract, which is for the company Prenda, for folks who don't know, it operates as a learning pods, which rely on a parent who can lead a pod, or with this particular contract they can work with a school district and have a school district sanctioned pod. But really, there's very little controls over this. You don't have the benefit of certified educator working with the children and all the benefits and the safeguards that come with that. And you've probably seen, if you're on Facebook much, and you're especially if you're a parent and they're targeting you that way, you've probably seen a lot of the advertisements. They've been advertising very heavily about that. And Zandra, who's next, can probably tell you a little bit more about the research that they've done on Prenda. NEA has done some research nationally on Prenda. It's really unfortunate use of dollars, especially for what they say they're using it for. They're saying they're using it for to cover sort of lost time for learning because of the pandemic. But one of the things that's telling about this contract is that school districts and largely the public really aren't using it. There's as Karen said, this contract was approved, sole source contract that was approved during the time when we were in a state of emergency and the governor was just signing contracts. But it recently came up for a contract amendment before the Executive Council a week and a half ago.
Yep.
And they couldn't, their contract was going to end and not enough people had taken it up. So the commissioner decided to submit a contract that just said, well, we're going to extend this contract out to 2024. We're going to encumber all this money that we have we're going to encumber up to $6 million in rescue plan money for this. And the reason they had to do that was because people aren't really using it. I mean, as I said, I think there's only five district schools that have actually formed a partnership on this front. So it's not a very popular program, and but it is a provider. The connection I think that Karen might have been getting at, it is also a provider. Prenda is for the state voucher program, so you can use your state voucher money toward Prenda. The other thing they did for Prenda was allow them to acquire facilities.
Yep.
So to sort of help them get a foothold in New Hampshire. But so we'll see how that develops and whether there's whether there's any more elevated interest in that. But it's an unfortunate use of what we could be using. We could be using these dollars much more effectively to help with kids who have struggled because of time out of the classroom.
I was going to say, or I did say, you just didn't hear me. We'll do Karen's question, and then in the interest of time, we'll move on. And I know that both Zandra and Brian are fully capable of answering a lot of these questions. So I will go ahead and take Karen's question.
I love it, by the way. For those of you who were here for the lobbying session, you will remember that we talked about the importance of following what's happening in the legislature, but we also talked about the importance of following what's happening in the Executive Council, and Karen just underscored that point exactly. My question for Brian is about, I think one of the most concerning issues is that public dollars are now being used to support religious education. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Certainly. And actually, I'll weave in a part that I didn't get to Karen Chase's question from before, which was the entity that so our school voucher program is really not run by our Department of Education. It's run by an entity called the Children's Scholarship Fund, and that was also done. They're the only contractor for that. So they actually are the ones who receive the public funds, and they are the ones, the sole entity that decides what counts as an educational expense and what doesn't. So it's a tremendous amount of authority that they have. And one of the ways we know they have used that and is they are required by law to post the providers that you can use this voucher money for on their website. And so if you go there, if you go to the Children's Scholarship Fund and look up education freedom accounts, you'll see a list of providers on there. And one of the themes that you will quickly notice is that there is a very heavy, I would say at least 70% of them are probably some kind of sectarian school. So all of the brick and mortar schools, which make up a big chunk of the list, our religious schools, schools that in not that long ago we would never have used public money to send to. We actually have a provision in our state constitution that still exists in the state constitution. It says you can't use public tax dollars for sectarian school. But I think because of the US Supreme Court, and they're actually just argued a case, I think a week ago or 2 weeks ago, that's going to impact this issue. But there was a decision from a few years ago that really started to open up the door to states that have voucher programs being able to use them for religious schools. But back to the list of providers, you'll notice that a lot of them are those sorts of schools. And if you look at any of the online courses, many of those are also have a heavy religious nature to them. And it had been a long-standing piece to the long-standing provision of our Constitution that public funds don't go to religious schools. But that's been changing. We have a voucher program now, and so that's harder and harder to stop.
Thank you. And so keep thinking about your questions. I'm going to let Brian and Zandra take a few minutes to change. And in the meantime,
I just put my email in the chat too, Deb. So if people have
perfect
questions that we didn't get to, you can, if you go to our webpage or at our legislative action page on our NEA-New Hampshire's website, you'll see the fact sheet and the take action we have about House Bill 607. So thank you all. Thank you very much for having me tonight. I'll transition out here.
Thank you.
Deb, maybe I could just say briefly that what Deb was able to do was connect with one of her colleagues, her former colleagues from Lebanon High School, who is now the chair of the Social Studies Department for Lebanon High School. And my child happens to be in Miss Valier's class. My child Zoe, who some of you know, is 15 and very engaged in their world history AP class. And we've had the discussion over the last couple of weeks that on more than one occasion, Miss Valier has actually censored herself, stopped herself from speaking, or has said, you know what, we're getting to a topic that I'm not really sure we can really talk about. And so that, even Zoe is very aware that this divisive concepts bill is really affecting the way that teachers are teaching. And so I think it sounds like, Deb, are you going to email that out to the group?
Well, I'll see what I can do. What Amanda did, and I'm sorry that it doesn't work, but she was a former student of mine, which made it even more special. And she spoke quite poignantly about what it means to teach world history and to be trying to put things into context, talking about communism, talking about socialism, having students ask questions, having students do the kind of inquiry you want students to do in a social studies class. But she said what's really very difficult is to draw parallels to contemporary world events and contemporary American events, because that's where she feels things start getting sticky. And as she pointed out, I taught at Lebanon High School for 27 years. We were constantly talking about the connections. We were constantly talking about how things cycle around again and the ways in which they influence our understanding of the past and the present. And at one point, Amanda says she finds herself thinking, is this the class where I will get an email? Is this the topic where I will get that phone call? Is this the time, the conversation where I'm going to get called into a meeting? And I found that just so distressing, that she's constantly carrying with her this self-screening, this self-censorship, this anxiety, and this level of stress, to wonder, to be thinking about what she's saying, not because, as I often have done, she thought she might make a blooper or say the wrong word, but self-screening because she doesn't know whether what she does next could result in a disciplinary case that could in turn result in her coming in front of a board of advisors or supervisors, and could lead to her losing her license to be a public school teacher, which is exactly the point of HB 544 and HB 1255, is to make people cautious, make them anxious, make them silent, and make them step back from what they are saying. And I think that that is a terrible statement about these bills. And I see that Zandra is now replaced Brian. And so I'm going to quickly introduce her, mainly by telling all of you, you should go to Granite State Progress's homepage and see this extraordinary woman, all that she does. She's also a member of the City Council in Concord. She has won umpty-dozen awards for her work. She is the founding executive director of Granite State Progress, which advocates for progressive issues. They monitor legislators, they do report cards, they monitor hate groups, they monitor the Free State Project. She has been a speaker for programs done by the Upper Valley Dems in the past. They have prepared handouts for school boards, for people looking to push back against anti-vaccination efforts. And I think she is just an outstanding individual right now. She, in fact, sent out the press release that I read following the vote in the Executive Council about Prenda. So I am just going to stop talking. I am going to give her the spotlight. And thank you, Zandra.
Thank you all, and I'm glad to be here with you. And I can't help but shake my head at the conversation you were just having, because that teacher's experience, that educator's experience, is exactly what we're hearing from educators all over the state. And I'm sure Brian covered a little bit of that. My role here tonight, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the ways we can take action, some of the opportunities before us, and I'm happy to take questions, or people know about other resources. There is a lot going on, as you heard in the legislative briefing, and a lot of our response efforts are kind of around this three-pronged piece: the underfunding of public education and the continual push for school privatization, the attacks on COVID public health, and then of course the attacks on racial justice and diversity, equity and inclusion justice efforts. I will say at the school board level, and I'm sure many of you are aware, it is multi-pronged. And what we're seeing is that the radicalization of some of these far right groups, they're bringing people in through one issue and they are moving them through the pipeline to these other issues. And so we need to be ready to talk to people. People who care about COVID public health also need to care about having strong public schools in our community. And they need to understand that the folks on the other side are using any issue they can latch onto to try to undermine our strong schools. There are a couple of things I want to talk to you about for resources that have sprung up, so you have a sense of what's out there and what some of the gaps are that we're trying to get filled through the various partnerships. So first, on the school privatization underfunding piece, I think people are aware of some of the groups like Reaching Higher, which does a lot of policy analysis. They actually have really great resources, and we rely on them for our numbers about what the impact of various bills will be on each community having that town by town analysis is so critical, especially as we want to try to find those individuals who may not already be a part of helping push back or being vocal champions for public education, to really understand what's happening in their community and to move them to action. Fair Funding New Hampshire. This is a kind of the offspring of Andrew Valinsky and the other individuals who'd worked on the Claremont lawsuit over the years. They're doing a 25 town tour right now, talking about how are our public schools funded? What is the debate in Concord been, and how can people get engaged? Zach Sheehan over at that organization would be more than happy to talk to people about bringing that presentation virtually or in person to communities. There is on the COVID public health piece, the Healthy 603 Coalition has started up. I'm going to tell you about this one with a slight word of caution. This is a very interesting coalition. I think it's going to do some really good work. It also has some partners at the table who I wouldn't say are always in agreement with my organization's policies around public health, right? Like they're worried because there's a lot of attacks on not allowing businesses to require masks or vaccinations. So you've got, folks from the BIA and pharma and some of these big industry trade groups, alongside groups like Granite State Progress, New Futures, By State Primary Care, New Hampshire Medical Society. Very fascinating, right? But there's some shared commonality about, we all understand how dangerous it is right now. And with some of these bills at the State House, some of which are specifically about schools and some which are broader and about communities. But honestly, it's going to, all of this, right, with COVID touches on one another. So I would encourage folks to take a look at that. I will say I just got the petition draft from them, and I think we need to make some edits to it. So I wouldn't say share that just yet. I want to have a conversation about the businesses shouldn't be told by the government that they can't mandate vaccinations. But I also think that government does have a role in saying if they should have public health policy. So we're going to make sure we are very thoughtful about the language as we maneuver this session. But it's going to be a lot of that kind of, back and forth, because right now, obviously, the key decision makers for the most part are the very small group of moderate Republicans we have left in the state legislature, and anybody else who could possibly be reasonable on some of these bills. So that's one resource that's developing. Granite State Progress, NEA, 603 Forward, Rights and Democracy, Campaign for a Family-Friendly Economy. Lots of different organizations. We're teaming up in different ways around candidate recruitment. We are very nervous about school board elections this year. It has been an extremely hard term to serve for anybody who's currently in office. It's not exactly the best sales job to say, hey, people are going to put your phone number online and harass you, and we really need you to still run for office or stay in office to protect our public schools. It is going to be really important that we do that early recruitment. And as we all know, town meeting season is literally weeks away at this point. So there is going to be a candidate training for anybody who's even remotely interested. On January 13th, the NEA 603 Forward and Granite State Progress are putting together, where I'm going to do a much better sales job than I just did about why people should run and how much support we have. And there is a lot of support out there, but we're seeing a lot of parents in particular step up for the first time and ask how they can help. And this has to be one of the messages back. You're very busy, but we have to have people run for office. And I always say Deb mentioned I'm a city councilor, and people say, oh, you got 2 young kids, how do you do it? I said, well, I'd rather be in the chair making the decisions than spending countless hours trying to get people to make the right decisions and not know whether or not they're going to do it. So if there's any reason to run for office, folks, it's just to get the job done the first time. There's also Rights and Democracy is doing a program they're calling HEAL. It's honest education, action, and leadership, where they're talking specifically about the roots of white supremacy. This leadership program is very much focused on the divisive concepts law and what it means, how we can start to have authentic conversations around an honest education. They've only had a couple of meetings so far, but it is a working group. So if people are interested, you can participate in their monthly calls around it. I think that's going to be a great resource because part of doing some of the work around the racial justice piece, right, is educating ourselves. I graduated high school 20 years ago, and I work with some young staffers who are light years ahead of me, and just how quickly they pick up this stuff, what they've learned. And I think it's going to be really important that as we try to push back on the really bad agenda that's trying to silence or whitewash American history, that we're also realizing that we need to do our own work to move forward and to articulate the positive, proactive agenda that we would like to see for our schools that reflect the full experiences of everybody in our community. And then kind of along with that, so Granite State Progress has been toying around with an anti-racism after school program. We've done 2 of the programs with Black Lives Matter, Seacoast, basically talking about what is CRT, right? Nobody's supposed to talk about it, not talking about it. Well, yeah, we're going to talk about it because the right's talking about it. And instead of like being hush hush, like let's be open and honest. What is it? What is it not? Where is it being taught? Not in K through 12 schools. That's for sure. But let's understand what we're talking about, and also kind of along those lines, what is not being taught currently that we think should be taught. And then that's kind of I'll kind of wrap up with that the last piece is Granite State Progress have been working to try to fundraise for an education justice organizer all fall, because I think we saw, as many people did, that the attacks on our schools are just nonstop right now, and it's really hard for local communities to know what to do in the face of that. I'm very happy to announce we've gotten that position funded. So we will be having, starting in January, an organizer who their whole goal will be to take what is happening at the State House, help local communities understand, like, is it signing a petition, testifying, sending, a communication to legislator, publishing an op-ed, and then now have, and then help support those local communities. So some of them are in a really, they've been dealing with this for months now, and they formed local community groups, and LondonDairyCares.net is one of the ones I'd encourage folks to take a look at. We think it's a really good model where they're talking about, let's not just be upset about what's happening. Like, let's be proactive. We need to be out there holding signs saying, I want my public school funded. I want public health in my public school. I want diversity, equity, justice, inclusion justice in my school. And those are some of the things that we can do to kind of flip the script and stop being so much on the defensive and get back to our footing, which is we are the public education champions, right? We are the social justice champions. We want to make sure that our schools are well funded, that the material is right and it's inclusive. And those are the things that we can do to help get us there. So I will go ahead and stop there. I think that's a pretty, make sure I didn't miss anything. I think those are pretty good review of all the things. I'm happy to take some questions.
Great. I just started belatedly typing some of that into the chat so that people had some of the information if you're not used to taking notes while someone is speaking. And just so that you say, well, great, they're in the chat, but I'm trying to listen to the program. If you look down at the very bottom of the chat, you will see 3 little dots, and you can hit that at the end of the program and it will save the chat for you. It's very kind of condensed, so don't leave it too long or you won't know what you're looking at. But that is at least one way you can get that information. So if anybody has a question, it would be great to have an opportunity to ask a question. You can put your hand up. You can also put it in the chat if you'd like. And I particularly appreciate Zandra talking about who we are and advocating who we are instead of spending so much time using the Republicans' language in a defensive model. We need to be talking about what we do, not what they tell us we do. So are there any questions out there? We've got a very active group of people here who I find hard to believe are so quiet. Go ahead, Karen.
Hi, Sandra.
Yeah.
I am wondering if you have some thoughts, with the legislative session coming up. Sounds like you're focused a lot on candidate recruitment and the local level. What are the types of things that you would encourage people, in the Upper Valley? I think we have to be concerned about our school boards as well. And I think in Lebanon, we certainly have seen the damage that can be done when when a particular mindset takes over a board. You can get into a position where, and we still hear this even in Lebanon, which now in November elections will vote 75% Democratic. That we also have an extremely difficult time passing our school renovation project, for example,